Over the past 4 seasons, Apple TV's For All Mankind has quietly become one of the most original and compelling science fiction series of the 21st century. In the process, it's created a television format that is truly unique, but one that also creates unique challenges for the series going forward. With Season 5 kicking off and a spin-off on the way, it's a great time to take a look at where this show started, how it's evolved, and the promise and peril of the road ahead. When Stanley Kubrick's 2001 was released in 1968, the future it presented was meant to be a realistic depiction of what the world might look like 33 years in the future. The 1960s were probably the last gasp of a kind of techno-optimism that viewed rapid technological and scientific progress as the road to a better and more prosperous future. This was the spirit that infused the 1964 World's Fair, and it culminated in NASA's Apollo program, which landed the first human beings on the moon in July of 1969. For a moment, this achievement captured the world's imagination. In the United States, it's estimated that 94% of households with TVs watched Neil Armstrong take his first steps onto the surface of the moon, with a global audience of around 650 million. NASA had expansive plans to build on the success of the Apollo program, with proposals to establish a moon base and send manned crews to Mars over the following decade. The future depicted in 2001 was extrapolated from this ambitious vision, but the reality was that public enthusiasm for the space program dissipated rapidly after Apollo 11. And budget cuts in the early 1970s forced NASA to scale back to more modest goals, like the Skylab Space Laboratory and the Space Shuttle. For All Mankind imagines what might have happened if we'd stayed on that more ambitious course. Ronald D, who created the series alongside Matt Wolpert and Ben Nedivi, describes the show as depicting the space program that was promised in the 1960s and 70s. Specifically, it imagines an alternate timeline in which the Soviets landed the first man on the moon, and then scored a further propaganda victory by landing the first woman shortly after. This turbocharges the space race, with NASA scrambling to train its first cohort of female astronauts and establish the first permanent base on the moon. With the Russians keeping pace at each step, the Cold War expands into an interplanetary rivalry, threatening to explode into a real-life Star War. But it also leads to the discovery of vast stores of helium-3 on the moon, which powers a revolution in fusion energy. By the 90s, the space race has expanded to Mars, with a private corporation competing with national governments to land the first human on the planet. This leads to the establishment of the Happy Valley mining operation, a joint project run by 7 nations and the Helios Corporation, which by 2003 is home to over 100 people. On the show, this alternate past unfolds over 4 seasons, with months or years sometimes elapsing between episodes, and larger leaps of up to a decade between seasons. This gives For All Mankind a structure that may be unique in the history of series television. If you think about what makes a television series successful, and especially the ones that endure in the public imagination long after they've left the air, you need a combination of elements. You need a setting that provides a versatile base for storytelling, a cast of characters that connects with the audience, and a premise that allows for a wide variety of stories while maintaining the same basic storytelling style. What's so fascinating about For All Mankind is that, after succeeding with all of these elements in its first season, the logic of its story has required it to systematically dismantle each one of them as the series progresses and replace them with new ones. Let's start with the setting. The timeline of the show has a very specific point of divergence from ours. January 14th, 1966. In our world, that's the day that Sergei Korolev, head of the Soviet space program, died of complications from surgery. Korolev was considered essential to the early success of the Soviet space program, on par with NASA's Wernher von Braun. In For All Mankind, Korolev survives his surgery and goes on to spearhead the Russian moon landing on June 26, 1969. The shock of this landing is what really kicks off the show's butterfly effect, as the fictional timeline begins significantly diverging from ours almost immediately after. There's a passing reference in Episode 1 to Senator Ted Kennedy canceling a planned party on Chappaquiddick Island to attend a Senate hearing into NASA's failure to beat the Russians. For those of you who don't know, Ted Kennedy was the younger brother of John and Robert Kennedy and was widely expected to follow them in seeking the presidency. But in 1969, Kennedy fled the scene of an auto accident on Chappaquiddick Island that left his aide, Mary Jo Kopechne, dead, derailing his presidential ambitions. On For All Mankind, this never happens, and Ted Kennedy goes on to defeat Richard Nixon in the 1972 election before being defeated himself by Ronald Reagan in 1976. This timeline, as depicted both on the show itself and in the Next Giant Leap videos on Apple+, is full of clever divergences from our world, which range from major events like the Vietnam War ending in 1970, to little Easter eggs like Close Encounters of the Third Kind winning the 1978 Oscar for Best Picture over Annie Hall, owing to the public's ongoing fascination with outer space. In this timeline, the space program receives full funding from the US government, allowing the show to resurrect abandoned NASA proposals like the Sea Dragon Heavy rocket. It also unearths largely forgotten bits of real history, like Operation Baby Lift, which airlifted over 3,000 orphaned Vietnamese children to the United States at the end of the Vietnam War, and the Soviet downing of Korean Airlines Flight 007 in 1983, which further inflamed already heightened tensions between the United States and the USSR. In its first 2 seasons, For All Mankind reflects and refracts real American history, allowing us to examine our past in a new light. This is especially true in Season 1, which has much the same appeal as Mad Men in resurrecting a relatively recent past that seems utterly foreign to modern audiences. It's overwhelmingly male and white, homosexuality is an offense warranting FBI investigation, and smoking is ubiquitous. For All Mankind suggests that, in extending the aspirational vision of the space program, we might also have achieved faster social progress here on Earth, while not shying away from depicting the ugliness of our real history. It's one of the most compelling aspects of those early seasons. But as the series moves into seasons 3 and 4, the divergences become so significant that it becomes almost completely detached from our actual history. The Soviet Union does not collapse in 1991, and 9/11 never happens. The fossil fuel industry withers into irrelevance with the introduction of nuclear fusion. By the time we reach 2003 in Season 4, the show has become almost pure speculative fiction. Although it's set in our past, it depicts a world that's well beyond our technological reach. It also depicts a very different political landscape, with the Soviet Union still a global power that's been recaptured by communist hardliners. Socially, it's a different world as well, especially in the United States. Many of the events that led to today's extreme partisan polarization never happened, including Newt Gingrich's takeover of the House of Representatives in 1994, the impeachment of Bill Clinton, the contested election of 2000, and the war in Iraq. Perhaps even more significantly, the internet was never open to commercial use. This means that the 2012 of Season 5 will be a world without Facebook, without Twitter, without Google. So at this point, the show is no longer set in a skewed version of our own reality, but has become what the creators acknowledge as a kind of spiritual prequel to Star Trek, imagining the path that might lead humanity to a more abundant and harmonious future. Alongside the changing times, the cast has undergone dramatic changes across these 4 seasons as well. Season 1 introduces us to a core group of men and women at the forefront of NASA's renewed push to expand the frontiers of manned spaceflight. Over the course of the season, we watch them risk death, devise ingenious solutions to seemingly hopeless problems, and navigate hardships in their personal and professional lives. We become invested in their stories, rooting for them as they push the boundaries of human achievement and sharing their pain as they grapple with loss and injustice. This main cast carries over into Season 2, continuing their stories into the mid-1980s. But as the show progresses into Seasons 3 and 4, these original characters begin to drop off, with new ones taking their place. Almost always, when a show's core cast starts to depart, it goes into an inevitable decline. It doesn't really matter how interesting or well-written the new characters are, they still feel like lesser replacements for the ones you've come to know and love. It's a bit like the experience many children of divorce have. No matter how great your new stepfather may be, he's still not your real dad. Usually, this kind of cast turnover happens because a show has been successful enough to reach the point where the actors' contracts have expired, and some of them choose to leave to explore new opportunities. But on For All Mankind, key characters are written out because the story demands it. People often complain about plot armor in movies and TV, the phenomenon where lead characters seem impervious to threats that would kill any regular person. It's the reason the stormtroopers in Star Wars are such lousy shots whenever Luke, Leia, and Han are around. The cast of For All Mankind doesn't have this protection. As co-creator Ron Moore puts it, the main character of For All Mankind is the space program itself, not any specific person. So the show is committed to dramatizing the costs of progress, even if it requires saying goodbye to beloved characters. This is best illustrated by the end of Season 2, when astronauts Gordo and Tracy Stevens devise a desperate plan to stop a nuclear meltdown by traversing the vacuum of the moon's surface in improvised spacesuits. The writer's original plan for the season called for the characters to survive this feat, and that remained the plan into the first weeks of shooting. But as they began to break that final episode, they realized that this would be a narrative cheat, and that in allowing these characters to die, it would give their act of heroism real dramatic weight. This commitment to allowing the logic of the story to dictate the fates of the characters is incredibly admirable and puts the writing of this show in the top tier of modern television. But that doesn't make it any easier to fully embrace the new characters with the same intensity as the original cast. There's also the fact that many of these new characters are very different types of people than the ones we started off with. The premise of this show in its early seasons revolved around the dangerous realities of cutting-edge aerospace technology, where every system is experimental and the margin for error is razor thin. It's a world in which the difference between slowing a command module to 35,600 feet per second and 35,680 is the difference between life and death. These constant life or death stakes were another thing that made those first seasons so compelling, and they required a certain type of character to traverse them. The characters we meet in Season 1 are bold pioneers, willing to risk everything to do what no one has done before. But as the story progresses and space travel becomes safer and more routine, we inevitably begin to encounter a more diverse range of personalities. We meet Dev Issa, an Elon Musk-like figure whose company Helios seeks to capitalize on the commercial potential of extraterrestrial mining. Later, we're introduced to Miles Dale, a Helios contractor who takes a job on Mars out of desperation after his skills as an oil rig worker are rendered obsolete on Earth. This story of a new class of worker drawn to outer space by economic incentives is one of the main focuses of Season 4. And if you take For All Mankind as an exploration of the challenges that will have to be overcome to reach Star Trek's egalitarian future, this is a crucial story to tell. It may even be a more important story than the one being told in those first seasons. But in a lot of ways, it's a less viscerally gripping story. This is the unique challenge of a show like For All Mankind, where staying true to the story can mean sacrificing some of the dramatic elements that made it so compelling in the first place. There's a scene early in Season 4 where Miles receives his first paycheck and learns to his surprise and outrage that not only has his pay rate been reduced due to delays in the asteroid mining operation, but Helios has deducted nearly a third of it to cover living expenses. This again is commenting on issues in our real world. You see extreme versions of this in places like Dubai, where service workers live in company housing outside the city proper and are often indebted to the very companies that brought them there. But there's also a version of this dynamic at play in cities like New York, where most working-class people can't afford to live anywhere near their places of work, and gig workers lack even the meager protections of minimum wage employees. But Ed Baldwin doesn't have any sympathy for these complaints. He's a 40-year veteran of the space program who saw friends and colleagues die to make this comparatively luxurious Mars colony possible. He holds these new recruits in a kind of contempt because to him, they're not there for the mission, they're just out to make a buck. So when Miles comes to him to explain that he was lured to Mars under false premises, Ed condescendingly tells him that what he needs to do is take some personal responsibility. Now, in the real-world version of this scenario, my sympathies are entirely with Miles and the rest of the workers, who are clearly being exploited by their employer. And Ed's response to them, at best, reveals his profound ignorance of what their situation actually is. But the thing is, for me, as the person watching this television series from the comfort of my living room, Ed is almost perfectly giving voice to what I miss about those first few seasons. I miss those brave and often reckless astronauts pushing their luck to the breaking point, and those stirring speeches about the grand promise of space exploration. It's a fascinating dilemma, because as much as I don't find this series in its fourth season nearly as compelling as I did in its first, and as much as I have an almost immune system-like resistance to connecting to the newer characters in the way that I connected to the original cast, I don't think any of this is a result of flawed storytelling or poor execution. To the contrary, I think this is a story being told with a seriousness and integrity that is exceedingly rare even among prestige television titles. And yet, that doesn't change the fact that much of what I most loved about the show is now gone, and what's taken its place just doesn't grab me with the same intensity. The upcoming spin-off Star City, which winds the clock back to the 1960s to follow the space race from the Soviet perspective, will likely offer a return to that earlier mode of storytelling. And as much as I don't know if For All Mankind will ever again be quite as captivating as it was in those first years, it remains one of the best series on television, and I can't wait to see what they have in store for Season 5. Thanks as always to everyone for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help. And leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'll see you back here next time.